Hello.
Hey.
Hello.
Um, so today, my topic is women at work, the things that maybe I go through that you guys might not go through, the things that you guys might not know how to deal with or say at work, because it is a topic that we are constantly looking. If you look at the local, if you look at the news, you watch it, are we all doing the right things, etc., etc. So I'll talk about my experience, I suppose, first as a woman in a leadership role. One of the things that I think I've actually heard said about me is that I slept my way to the top. Yes. And it's one of those things that you've got to contend with because you're going to defend it. And you're like, why am I defending that? But as a young person, maybe when I was I was in a director's role at 28, 29, you have imposter syndrome anyway. And so then you start wondering, oh, well, is it because there was a bit of favoritism there? Or is it that I'm actually good at what I'm doing? And it's only now, if I'm in my sort of mid 30s, that you realize that, oh, I am actually good at the things that I'm good at. But it takes time to work that out because you're still growing up, or I was still growing up, and you do ask those questions about yourself. That's just one example of something that I've had to contend with as a leader in a role, and those thoughts that people have about you in that position. It's only now that I get used to those, but are we thinking about that for some of the other women that work for us? Should I be doing something because of that experience to say, actually, this is what we should be putting in place for our staff so that they never feel like that? Let's take that to the bottom, because I was able to ignore it and carry on. But what are some of the issues there?
Yeah, it's first of all, so shocked actually at what you just said. It's like wildly outright. It's stunning, to be honest. But again, I suppose society has shown that always be prepared to be further surprised. I guess another thing that I have witnessed or I've experienced in conversation with women in the workplace is just how you've kind of got like this whole paradox or duality in terms of how you approach things, right? So if you or what I've often been told is if you speak up, make your opinions known, you can be almost labeled as, oh, she's a bit bossy or opinionated or whatever else. And then, or if you don't do that, then you kind of end up like swallowing a lot of your opinions just to kind of like toe the line and conform. So it's like, you end up either conforming or you end up either sticking out and being labeled whatever else. But it's hard to kind of just be seen as someone who will sometimes agree with something, sometimes disagree with something, have your own opinions. You're always labeled as one or the other. So that you kind of end up in that lose-lose situation. Again, I mean, this is something I've been reliably informed of on a number of occasions. But yeah, and as someone who wants to kind of work your way further up in the career ladder, obviously you're going to be in a position of leadership, which means you can be perceived as, bossy, unlikable, just because of that level of assertiveness, whereas those same things aren't labeled on men.
Yes.
In that same context. So that's something, if we're taking this to the bottom as well, that I think is unfairly faced.
Yeah, I say there's some other things, I suppose. You talked about imposter syndrome, and everybody experiences that. But I think when you look through the lens of what people have been brought up through society, expectations are built up over time. And so we still have some areas where men are expected to lead. And I don't mean this in every scenario, conventionally. And so those men go into those situations often expecting that I'm supposed to be leading. And so when they're put in a position where they're not leading, some don't know how to deal with that. And that's the same coin to the other side where a woman says, well, I'm leading now and I wasn't brought up to do so. Society didn't teach me to do so. And so everyone's being challenged by this sort of like latent force within them of what I was supposed to be. And it can create atmospheres where actually people just want to do their jobs, but there's this extra layer now of not understanding why they feel they're not able to do what they're supposed to be doing in the way they should be doing it. And so it just creates random unnecessary tensions. And the other thing that happens is, what ends up happening, I believe, is that it opens the door for misinterpretation, which is huge. And so something which I might do, if I put it in racial terms, might be easy for me to say. So there might be something that a Charlie, for example, could do to me, which I see as his mistake. Whereas if there was a climate of racism and a white person, for example, done the same thing, it might feel more loaded. And it might be more loaded, but just because there's so much of that in society of racism and sexism, the opportunity for me to take that really impacts the working relationship. And then when it happens in numbers across teams, then it almost becomes indisputable. And that creates this whole other layer. And so it was almost like a gender war in the workplace.
Yeah, but on the flip side of that, I mean, with, I guess, more awareness, you know, you could, and I suppose this is happening more and more these days, you kind of have to know when to avoid certain things in certain scenarios. I know a lot of things can be like innocent mistakes, but I'll give you an example, and this is probably a terrible example. So that's my disclaimer in advance. But I saw a thing recently about Park Ji-sung. I've probably said that name the wrong way around. The former football player for Man United. Now, the Man United fans, they had a chant for him. Obviously, it was endearing and, you know, they really liked him. But he's come out recently saying that he wants them to stop that chant because there's a bit in there that says something about something that's offensive, basically. I won't go into it, but something that it can be deemed as offensive. Now, he knows that they didn't mean anything by it, but at the time he was a bit conflicted, and now he's come out and said, look, I don't like that particular thing. I'd like you to no more do that chant no more. So that's an example of where, like what you're saying, well, the point I'm trying to make is with that added awareness, you can avoid those situations.
Of course, but I think also, and I think you're stepping up from the bottom just a little bit, but I think even to in the areas where it does still have a negative impact is on both sides of that. You can then be worried about how to approach someone, and they just want to be approached the same as everybody else. Yeah, so now a man is approaching a female manager or leader in a way where they're cautious or tentative. Similarly, the female leader might approach her male colleagues or any of her junior staff tentatively, because she has to feel like, if I do it this way, I'm going to be perceived as something rather than just doing it. And you open a door for criticism, which actually human beings do to anybody. But it's all these small, and I think the biggest reflection is from society. Whatever society is projected makes it harder in a workplace to ignore. And so in the workplace, things take on its own life. Everybody understands that work situations are magnified because you're around people all the time. It becomes a really intensive environment. And so if society has any sexism in it, which it does, any misogyny, which it does, then it's going to translate into the workplace in some form. And I think that creates sometimes a suffocating experience for men and women. But I suppose the brunt is on women in the sense that men have existed in the workplace forever. And so they're having to adapt, whereas women are having to join something newly. And I think that's a harder change than men having to still have their jobs, but understand actually you're not the only people in the sphere anymore.
You're right about the sort of educational thing and starting from there. But so, for example, it can build resentment. So, for example, I've got, when we started the company, I was left in charge of HR. And it was like, I think I'm in charge of HR because it's a girly thing. It's got the connotations of that caring thing attached to it. But I'd never done HR in my whole entire life. But it was something that was left to me. And you do it because everyone's pitching in, everyone's doing it. But actually, who was going to ask that question of, is this something you want to do? Is it something that you're good at? So you're constantly fighting with, oh, I need to do this for the business. I need to do it to get it off the ground. I need to because it needs to be covered. But is it because I'm a woman that I was given that role to look after?
Yeah. I think having that question, and I think to try and come towards, like you say, solutions and education, there's a lot of words and actions that do change because of the differences in men and women and how things are perceived. And so you brought up the thing about sleeping to the top, for example. And one of the reasons why I think that is prevalent is because it's seen that women, the narrative is that women use sex to gain power and men use power to gain sex. And the act, if you think about the act of sex, not that I'm changing what the meaning of the podcast is the same between the two. But for some reason, the narrative is there's a transfer there. And so it will be levied against man is if you're already in power, you're using your power to get sex. And suddenly that woman is using it. And it's like, but why has that happened? That's a societal thing that has determined that the exchange is that this is what you bring forward and I have to bring power. And so for a man who more than not is not going to be desirable in the sexy scale, if let's call it that, their only thing they have is power. And so they hold, there's more of an intensity to hold on to that power. Whereas I suppose women, you could say, have the desire and then also now can have power. So some of it is just about changing what we view these things aligned as. And so there are some things which are more fit feminine. You talked about HR, but PR, when they look at traits, they say that women are better at PR just because of what are typically feminine traits. So it's whether do we embrace these differences like we do with race and say that actually some people are faster, some people are stronger, some people, I don't know. It's knowing what are the bits that we willingly want to embrace on a societal level, understanding that as individuals, anything can be different.
I think that's the point though, isn't it? Yeah, that's the point, is that you might be, I know some women who wouldn't be good at HR.
Of course.
Just because they're a woman doesn't mean that they're going to care more
or when you look at PR jobs, it's not about not HR, PR, they say that public relations, women tend to succeed more. And again, it's not, when you deal with these things, you never talk about what everybody can do. You just talk about the top and who feels that those jobs, who tends to go to those, whether it's STEM research or whatever it might be. I'm not saying whether it's right, these are just the data that they found. And so how much of that indicates a freer society, that the natural persuasions are heading one way, and how much of it is indicating that people are being funneled one way? It's hard to know that, but the point is that every individual should have their place within that.
Yes.
Understanding though, and I think this is the bit from my perspective for the individual to take on, is understanding that people use stereotypes and convention to navigate through the world. We understand that most cars travel at a certain speed, so we avoid them. We understand that most pavements operate in a certain way, so we walk a certain way on it. It's like how we familiarize ourselves with the world. I use this as random examples. And so stereotypes have negative connotations, but some of them have positive. And so if you look at what how we deal with children, how we deal with teenagers, there's things that we stereotype against teenagers that would let us know how we might approach a teenager if we had to speak to them that we didn't know, or if we met them for the first time, or an elderly person, how we'd approach them. Like racial stereotypes born of ignorance are negative and pejorative, but it is worth knowing that that is just how people approach the world, is by what have I seen en masse, how do I approach the situation? And it's trying to understand that a little bit as well, I think.
It's not any less damaging though, in terms of the effect that it can have, which I guess is why we're all here. I don't think many people set out to, I mean, some people, yeah, fair enough, but not the majority of people don't set out to say, oh, I'm going to be intentionally offensive, I'm going to put everyone down, and all of that stuff. A lot of it is coming from blind spots, but it's still doing this just the same amount of damage. I guess while we're still taking things to the bottom. Another thing that popped up in my mind, just around the whole education thing, is that can also backfire a little bit in that sometimes that narrative is, oh, you guys need to, change your behavior because, you're terrible people and and that can then also lead to resentment and separation as well, making it, an us versus them, and which is then going to lead you to the place that you want to get to. I know some of the message does need to be told. I know some of the message isn't easy to hear. But I think, I mean, to be honest, even data shows that if you present this thing in, if you can present that in a certain type of way, you almost kind of counteract the effect you want to achieve, right? Like in being, how do I want to say it? In being blaming and very negative and derogative in the way that you put that message across, you almost kind of alienate the people that you kind of want to get them to change their behavior and bring them on side. So yeah, I think even with the education and awareness side of things, you kind of have to be, if your main focus is to change the behavior, you have to be careful about, careful even. You have to deliver that message in a certain way.
So I think there's two there's two things. So the main point that Jankee brought up was women in leadership and some of the experiences and how you deal with that, and on top of imposter syndrome and all those the extras. And so I think I suppose what I was indicating before is society makes slow change. That takes culture. Which is why we deal with stuff like representation, people having more people in leadership on TV or available to see. That's one thing that we all need to push and be aware of, and where you can embrace that. It's difficult because, for example, if you're a man, for example, you're not going to not apply for a job because a woman's going for it, because you still need to look after your family, which might involve women as well. But it's understanding that as a society, there needs to be an improvement on how that's represented. As an individual, I would say stuff like this. So I have a friend who's doing really well, and she had an important meeting where she was leading the meeting. At the end of the meeting, an elderly gentleman stayed behind to say, "You're quite intimidating, aren't you?" And it really bothered her because they had a meeting the next day of how, whether that meant she should change and whether everybody was feeling that. And what I said to her was, you can either feel like you were intimidating, or you could accept that he felt intimidated. And he's the one that has the problem. He's the one that has to go home and talk to someone, not you, and think, how can I be more assertive next meeting? Make it his problem. And I think when we strip away what it means to be called bossy and what it means to be called intimidating, or what it means to be called whatever, I mean, we will accept there's horrible bosses that existed forever, long before women have been the bosses. It's how do you take it and not allow it to be something negative while society is building that change, and actually see it for what it is. It's normally coming from people who they're struggling with their own issues. That's what it normally is. I don't think that a woman boss is less likely than a male boss to be a bad boss. So sometimes maybe you do need to accept the criticism and say, actually, I need to do things a different way. But I don't think, and it's easy for me to say, of course, but I don't think it's something that we should readily accept, that just because people use these terms and because society, for example, has decided that women use sexual power, that as individuals, we need to accept that claim. And I think that's a difficult thing to do, and it's easier said than done. But that's, while society is making it change, I think it's also having that ability to say that in leadership, there's things that come with it that I can fight against, and that I actually am passing the baton on to the next person in a slightly better position if I take on and have the courage to go through some of those things. But again, it's a hard thing to say because it's much easier said than done, and everybody goes through these things at different levels, and some people can't take that on and own that sort of position.
I think that's part of it, isn't it? It's if you have the ability to get past it, then great. But what do you do for the people that are around you?
Yeah.
To start paving that way, or changing some of that behavior, or changing some of the culture. That, so for example, Charlie, when you said that you can people kind of go the opposite way where they're being told to do what they're being recommended, don't say it like that, and then they can go the other way. It's surely that's our culture to change, to accept criticism, to accept the power that I hold. I need to check it every now and again. The power that a man holds in the workplace needs to check that every now and again. And as leaders, we can change that culture without it becoming a big fight between genders and all the various genders. So what do we now do then as leaders to prevent someone else having ever to hear that thing? Because ultimately we're trying to change society. Like you're saying, Deola, we're trying to get to a point where we've evolved enough that those sorts of things aren't said, but we've all got the power to do that and to contribute to that maybe a bit faster than if it was left on its own. So
well, everything in all of these discussions from race and gender all boils down to power. If the more power you have,
probably agree with that.
The more you can influence and impact. Like you could have a white male who's essentially seen across the world as the people with the most power, who has less power than anybody else, and he doesn't feel that power. And it might not be because he's white male, which is what I accept people will say, but he is as powerless as anybody else. When you have power, you have responsibility. And so in that power, you might have to struggle and go to someone and get counsel and get support and call things out when you see them for the individual. But the more you use that power responsibly, the better you make it for the person beneath you or below you or coming along beside you. Like just from people witnessing what you're doing who work with you, Jankee, they've grown up now, or they've worked with this idea that of course a woman's in leadership. And they won't know every trial. They won't know like what shocked what you said to Charlie shocked him today. But there's people in more recent years who've not had the opportunity to even make that suggestion about you, because when they've arrived in the company, they've seen you there. And so it's like, actually, that's just normal here. And so there is, I think, as much as I don't think society in 2021 loves this, but there is an element of what's they called the cowboy, or the first, is it India? Even this is probably a negative stereotype. I mean, they said the first Indian above the parapet, I think they said something like that. I can't remember when it was cowboys and Indians. It's like the first head is going to get shot at. But actually, you need those first heads to come out to take those hits for the next people to come forward. And of course, we don't want anyone to take hits, but I think there's a bit of reality in life, is that if you have the power and, like you said, the ability to take those hits, hopefully you're not leaving the next person. I think I carry it as a black man in terms of what can I do so that my son doesn't have to have the same battles I do. I don't want to have as many battles as I might have, but if I do have them, I want to overcome them such that someone coming up beside me doesn't have to have the same battles. Although I would say to them, they should expect other ones.
As a male then, who in the traditional sense holds the power over a female, are there things that you think that you could do that would help that? Or have you heard things that you'd be like, actually, that could have been said better, and you have because you hold that power in that dichotomy, is there something that you could be doing? Do you feel like it's your responsibility to do that as well? Or is it mine to just lead the way and pave the path?
No. I do think it is everyone's responsibility, right? You talk about changing a culture, changing society. They also talk about bystander intervention. You know, if you see some of this stuff happening, to call it out, even if it is not happening to you. And that can be something that is quite supportive to the person who might be going through that thing at the time. So, you know, if you have the power or the ability to, and you're witnessing something happening, you know, and you're recognizing what is happening, you know, you can take so and so aside, you can say something, you can, you know, if you're in a position to do something, to intervene in some way to alleviate this situation, then do so, because
I think when there's dramatic, I don't want to say dramatic, big situations, and I think that's clear, there's a burden. If you see something wrong, do something. But it's all just the day-by-day stuff, isn't there? And I'd be honest, I'd have to be honest and say that I wouldn't notice a lot of the day-by-day stuff. I'd be thinking about my own struggles. I don't even want to say as a black man, this is a human being trying to get through the next stage of life and the travails. What I would say is, if you want to be good and support society, it's when you know better, do better. And so as there's something comes to light, how do you respond to that? I was saying to Jankee just earlier that today I was walking and someone bumped into the back of me, a white lady, and I turned around to see who it was, and she screamed and looked fearful as if I was going to attack her. And I was suddenly conscious that everybody in the street is going to feel as though I'm doing something wrong. So my thing immediately, because I know that, was to just quickly placate her and say it's fine, even though all I did was get bumped in the back and worry about my own safety for that split second. And so I feel like that's just an example of a man understanding that I turned around and saw a woman who, even if the reality is, even though I can laugh at it, the reality is she was probably frightened. She probably wasn't paying attention, bumped into me, saw me as a man and understood, especially with the current climate, that actually I'm strong, probably stronger than her. And if I did react angrily, she'd be in a bad situation. So even though I'm not done anything wrong, my knowledge of that should allow me to not be like, why are you screaming for? And make the situation worse. I can use that knowledge and just say, just take that moment and be like, okay, fine, I can carry on. And I think in the workplace, there'll be moments as a man where sometimes you're in the wrong, sometimes you're not. But actually, if you're reading the room, you should be able to realize and go, I don't need to challenge this situation. I don't need to talk over this person. Even if I would, you might say to yourself, I talk over everybody. But actually, if you read the room and you understand that that's the problem, try harder not to do it. And I think that's the individual responsibility. When it comes to your life, do something about it. It's hard to wear it all the time, because the reality is everybody's got their own struggles. But when you're aware of it, do something about it.
I suppose that's part of it then, is we've spoken about privilege before, maybe not in this forum, but everybody has a part, something, or most people have a bit of privilege that they hold in certain groups of people or at work. So for example, I've got a privilege by being in a leadership role. It's understanding what comes with that and my responsibilities with that. Same, I would say, for many at work, it's you have a privilege there. It's you are either a supporter and help that situation or help women, or you stand by and not do anything. So, but because of the power that we all hold individually in different ways, it's understanding the power that you hold first, I suppose, Say, actually, I've got this that maybe that person next to me doesn't have. So because I'm a man, I'm going to get away with this a little bit more, and she's not going to get away with that. So what do I now do to help that? I might do that as a now older woman, not older woman, but a middle-aged, middle 30s woman with some of the new girls that are starting, and say, actually, I now hold this privilege. This is what I can do for them to make them more comfortable. I think that's fair.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think I don't disagree with anything what you just said. There's an element of it's that being humanity, isn't it? Is that ultimately when you can do something, will you do it? And I think it goes both ways, because if it's just about power and leadership, then it's almost accepting the people you manage to not see that, because they're looking up resentfully, thinking you have all the power. But there should be a human element of, even if I don't have the power, how can I respect the person who does? Because if you as a woman manage me, I might view you as the person with the power and have resentment for that. But actually, I shouldn't do that. And this is it's a very, what's the word, utopic sort of viewpoint of life. But the reality is, you want the people to have the power, not to abuse it, and you want the people who aren't being abused to respect everybody else. And
it is. I mean, the human experience can be obviously is one that is very much from your own perspective. So sometimes you're either you're just missing this stuff because you're so focused on yourself, or you can be blind to a lot of what's going on around you. I guess it's just about trying to check ourselves and not reacting the wrong way when we are checked, however we might be checked by someone else. And just to be aware that these are the things that are needed to kind of make this whole situation better.
Do we feel like the conversation is focused or derailed in the context of business, in terms of, is it the same conversation? Is it women in leadership and making sure that people feel respected and not imposter syndrome and not being labeled? Is that the same conversation as improving work outcomes, the business outcomes at work? Is it the same conversation, or is it a separate thing where it doesn't matter how one impacts the other? Is it the same conversation? I hope it is, but is it? So when you fix one, do you fix the other? When you improve one, do you improve the other? Or is there an acceptance that it doesn't matter if the business outcome is going to be better or worse, then this is what we're going to do, and vice versa? Because then that would show, I don't know what it would show, but would it show in some corporate entities why people have chosen one over the other? Whereas if you look at diversity on the whole, the message that is preached is that this is going to improve things. Do we feel like there's enough evidence that actually
there is data to show that increased representation, but it's specifically with regards to having women in the workplace, that does have, bottom line business benefits, if you were going to look at it from that perspective. But yeah, there is data to support that. I mean, even when you just look at representation as a whole, if you are better represented in your company, you are then better representing society and would be able to meet the needs of society, depending on what business you are, better. So even just looking at it from that black and white, without going into some of the stats and the stuff, I mean, I don't have any of it to hand.
So I have one more question following that. Do you both believe that what we're experiencing right now is actually a rapid change if you look at the timeline of history, but slower change than what we think should happen and what we'd hope to happen? Or are we looking at actual resistance? Is there resistance to embracing women in leadership, for example? Or is it just that it's changing, but it's changing slower than we can imagine it now, given that now we have access to more knowledge, more data, the world is more progressive, but the changes aren't keeping up with the speed of what we want to happen, but it actually is going positively? Or is there actually resistance and it feels like...
I believe it's positive. I mean, maybe I'm not the person who can give this answer properly. I mean, just from my perspective, but again, my perspective may be skewed on this. So
I think, yes, there are positive changes, but your question was, is it going at the speed that it's going to go at because we are a society that's complex and it's going to get better? But my sort of rebuttal to that is, if I want it to happen, then it should be happening. Because if we're saying that, oh, this needs to happen, then it has to happen. And that's where change sometimes comes, where that forceful sort of actually listen to what's happening here, understand what's happening to this group of people, regardless of what it is. And if that change is wanted, then it has to move at that pace that it's wanted. Does that make sense?
Of course,
Because we can't leave it to organically do it.
No,
no means am I
not at
saying,
all.
no means am I saying that. I think I was just saying that, is it happening as quick as what the people's pushing? Because you can want something to happen, but because we're dealing with society, it's so large, the elephant has to turn. Just like changing the culture of a business, you want a business to change its process. You understand that it turns slowly. I'm just saying, is it that the boat is being turned slowly? And that doesn't mean that people should stop trying to push it quicker. They should. Or does it feel as though there is resistance to it? That's the crucial thing I'm saying. Does it feel as though there's, as much as there's voices saying, because there's a lot of voices hopefully saying this needs to change, do you feel like there's significant voices standing in the way? Like, or where does that opposition come from? That's apart from ignorance, I suppose, but where is there resistance, and where does it come from? Maybe that's a silly question, I don't know.
I don't think it is specific resistance. I think that however, ignorance has to be, is the thing, but actually that's not an excuse.
Yeah.
And we say that a lot about ignorance anyway, but there has to be that change of culture and mentality and education that creates that change. And whilst, yes, it could be ignorance, that doesn't make it okay.
And I think that's the good answer, because again, I'm not looking for the excuse. If you know the reason, then it helps you find a solution. And so if the primary opposition is ignorance, then education is the primary solution. But if there was something more sinister that we can find, saying actually there's politicians or there's people with power, that's the main resistance. There's like, we need to put more resources into tackling that. Whereas if it's just the sum of individual human beings' ignorance, then the bigger solution would happen generationally when the next generation has gone through school, for example, or other places where you reach people who are already at work, or through TV if they watch it. Because educating adults is harder because you don't have a forum for it. And so it's like, if that's the primary thing you have to attack, then society needs to attack education in the areas where you can reach people who will be ignorant. And some of that you'd expect generations to have a massive leap. If you go to universities now, the way they talk is very different than 20 years ago because of that. So, and there's loads of like speakers who are not allowed into universities because the culture has been educated out. And so that would give me reason to be hopeful for the future, that with this new education, if it's good enough, I'd have to go and check, that you'd see it differently because that some of that ignorance has been washed away.
Yeah. At the same time, you can't say it's solely ignorance. I think that story that I started with is somebody probably going, what's this about? And that's not ignorance, actually. The other example that Deola uses at me all the time, because I came back and told him that this is what somebody said to me, was that was at a contract meeting, and he said, we'd finalised the contract, and he was like, welcome to a man's world. And you're like, is that ignorance or is that a power thing that you just did?
Exactly. Yeah. So I'd say that's a good sum. I mean, obviously there's probably more to it, but I'd say ignorance is one part, and another part is that unwillingness to give up power, or fear of having to give up power. And it's like, how do you deal with that? And that's that challenge is as old as time. So people with power want to keep it. That's got its own challenge altogether. And whether you're dealing, whatever the form you're dealing with, people holding on to power, we see people do desperate things and say desperate things when they're holding on to power. And that's a completely different challenge. And that's the only thing I would say about that is, as we're creating new people who will gain power, it's educating and preparing people to be responsible with it, which is why we said earlier, how do you do, even as a woman, even as a black man, you can, because again, people, I use the example of race, you could talk about how black people are treated, but then you can look at a black person with power, how do they treat other black people? If they've got the same sense of power, they'll just treat them the same way. It just won't be viewed as racism. Same to a woman. You can have a woman who treats another woman terribly once she has power, because human beings aren't very good with power. And so while we educate people out of their ignorance, how do we develop children? How do we develop young people who are going to be the future leaders and holders of power to not abuse it when they have it?
Well, I think that leads us on to our next topic, actually. So how about we end that one there, think about some of those things and have that conversation the next time, is how are we going to change some of the stuff that we've spoken about today?
Yeah.
Very cool.
Lovely. All right.